There's a number that requires no introduction, no context, no explanation. It speaks entirely for itself. 330,000. 330,000 soldiers, not conscripts pulled from their homes in the final hours of a desperate war, not raw recruits who had never heard a shot fired in anger. These were men who had crossed entire nations under fire, men who had broken armies that were supposed to be unbreakable, men who had done things on the battlefield that military historians still struggle to fully explain, not because the facts are unclear, but because the scale of what they achieved defies easy comprehension. And yet, of those 330,000 men, fewer than 6,000 ever saw their homeland again. Here is what I want you to sit with before we go any further. If you had been one of those soldiers marching east in the summer of 1942, part of the most powerful army Germany had ever assembled, would you have trusted the orders that sent you there? Or would something quiet inside you have known that the road ahead led somewhere there was no coming back from? Drop your answer in the comments, because by the time the story ends, that question is going to mean something very different than it does right now. Now let's go back, far back, because to understand how 330,000 men vanished from the face of the earth, you first have to understand what they were, what kind of force carries that kind of weight, earns that kind of reputation, and then disappears, not in a single catastrophic battle, but slowly, deliberately, almost surgically, consumed by a city that had already been reduced to rubble before the killing even began. This is the story of an army built to be unstoppable, and of the city that proved it wasn't. Every military force in history carries within it the logic of its own creation. The way an army is built, the philosophy it absorbs, the battles it fights, the commanders who shape its instincts, all of that accumulates over time like geological layers. And when the moment of true pressure arrives, what the army does is not a matter of individual courage or individual failure. It is the total expression of everything it was made to be. The 6th Army of the German Wehrmacht was formally established in the autumn of 1939. The ink on Poland's defeat was barely dry. Across Europe, militaries were observing what Germany had just done. The speed, the coordination, the almost clinical efficiency with which an entire nation had been militarily dismantled in weeks, and they were struggling to explain it using the frameworks they already possessed. Because what had happened in Poland was not simply a matter of superior numbers or better equipment. It was a matter of doctrine. The German military in that period operated on a philosophy so counterintuitive to traditional military thinking that many of its opponents refused to believe it was real until it had already destroyed them. The principle was elegantly simple in theory and extraordinarily difficult to execute in practice. You did not attack an enemy along his entire line, grinding forward through attrition and exhaustion. You found his weakest point, or you created one, and you drove through it with concentrated armored and motorized force, penetrating so deep and so fast that the enemy's command structure collapsed before his fighting units could even receive coherent orders. Speed was not a tactic. Speed was the weapon, and the 6th Army was built to use that weapon better than almost any other unit in the German order of battle. Its early commanders instilled something that proved even more important than firepower or technology: a culture of initiative at every level of command. German military doctrine gave officers at the battalion level not merely the authority, but the explicit professional obligation to act on battlefield opportunities without waiting for permission from above. If you saw a gap, you moved through it. If the situation changed, you adapted. The orders from higher command defined the objective. The path to that objective was yours to find. This principle, known in German military theory as Auftragstaktik or mission-based command, made German units operate with a coherence and speed that their enemies found almost impossible to counter in those early years. By the time an opposing commander had identified what was happening, communicated it up the chain of command, received a response, and begun organizing a countermeasure, the situation on the ground had already changed twice. The first major test of the 6th Army came in the spring of 1940, the invasion of France and the Low Countries. And here, the 6th played a role that its soldiers at the time could not fully appreciate, because its true importance was strategic. not tactical. It was the decoy. While the world watched German forces pour into Belgium, watched the Sixth Army fight with genuine ferocity, cross rivers under fire, shatter Belgian defensive lines, and push hard toward the coast, the decisive blow was being delivered elsewhere entirely. German armored formations were moving through the Ardennes forest, terrain that French strategic planners had classified as impassable for mechanized forces. It was not impassable. It was simply unexpected. The Sixth Army did not need to know it was a distraction to fight like it wasn't one. Its men moved, pressed, attacked, and advanced, and in doing so, held the attention of Allied command at exactly the moment when Allied attention could least afford to be divided. What came afterward, the collapse of France, the evacuation from Dunkirk, the armistice, reshaped the European continent in weeks, and the Sixth Army emerged from it with something no training exercise can manufacture: a collective confidence born of victory in circumstances that demanded genuine excellence. Then came the East. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June of 1941, was the largest military invasion in recorded human history. More than 3 million German and Axis soldiers crossed into Soviet territory along a front that stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The stated objective was the destruction of the Soviet state before winter. The Sixth Army was assigned to the southern thrust into Ukraine, toward the industrial heartland of the Donbass, and eventually toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that Germany's war economy desperately needed. What they found in those early weeks seemed to confirm everything their experience had told them about how this war would go. The Red Army of 1941 was in a state of profound institutional crisis. Stalin's purges of the late 1930s had systematically eliminated thousands of experienced officers, generals, colonels, commanders who carried in their minds decades of accumulated tactical and strategic knowledge. What remained was a force with enormous human resources and significant material strength, but with a command structure that had been surgically damaged at its most critical levels. The early battles were devastating for the Soviets. In September of 1941, German forces, with the Sixth Army playing a crucial role in closing the flanks, encircled 4 complete Soviet armies near Kiev. The number of prisoners taken exceeded 600,000. There is no comparable operation in the history of modern warfare. 600,000 men surrounded, cut off, and forced to surrender in a single strategic maneuver. But here's where the story begins to carry the seed of something darker. Germany was winning battles of unprecedented scale, and yet the Soviet Union was not breaking. Not the way France had broken, not the way Poland had broken. Every time the German advance destroyed another army seemed to form behind it, drawing on reserves from the Urals, from Siberia, from depths of human and industrial resource that German strategic planning had catastrophically underestimated. Winter arrived. The advance slowed, then stopped, and the Sixth Army, which had crossed Europe in a season of victories, found itself holding defensive lines in temperatures that fell to -40 degrees, in uniforms designed for a campaign that was supposed to be over by autumn, fighting an enemy that did not fight the way enemies were supposed to fight, that attacked in darkness, that disappeared into snowstorms, that seemed to absorb punishment and return it with compound interest. The army survived that winter. That fact alone deserves emphasis. Many German units along the Eastern Front were so badly damaged by the Soviet winter counteroffensives of 1941 and 1942 that they had to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The Sixth Army held. Its structure remained intact. Its experienced officers and non-commissioned officers, the irreplaceable human infrastructure of any military unit, were still in place. It entered 1942 battered, reduced, tested in ways its men had not anticipated when they crossed into Soviet territory with summer still warm on their backs. But it was still a coherent, combat-capable force, still the most formidable single army in the German order of battle. And then came the man whose name would be permanently fused with both its final campaign and its final catastrophe. Friedrich Paulus assumed command of the Sixth Army in January 1942. He was, by every professional measure, an exceptionally gifted staff officer, meticulous in planning, precise in organization, deeply versed in the theoretical architecture of large-scale military operations. He was not, however, the kind of commander who trusted his own instincts when those instincts contradicted the orders he had received from above. In an army that had built its success on the initiative of its commanders, Paulus represented something subtly different. A man who was brilliant at executing plans and deeply uncomfortable when circumstances demanded that plans be abandoned. That distinction would not matter for most of 1942. It would matter enormously in November. Operation Blue, Germany's strategic offensive for the summer of 1942, was built on a logic that was not irrational. The previous year had demonstrated that the Soviet Union could absorb territorial losses and keep fighting. But could it absorb the loss of its oil supply? Could it continue to function if the critical artery of the Volga River, along which vast quantities of fuel, grain, and military material flowed, was severed? The answer Germany was betting everything on was no. The Sixth Army was assigned the northern flank of this offensive. Its task was to advance east across the steppe, cross the Don River, and secure the northern shoulder of the operation as German forces drove south toward the Caucasus. In its path lay a city stretched along the western bank of the Volga, an industrial center of approximately 500,000 people, producing tanks, artillery pieces, and the machinery of Soviet war. The city's name was Stalingrad. It is worth pausing here to consider something that professional military historians have noted repeatedly, and that is still not fully appreciated in popular accounts of this campaign. Stalingrad was not initially the primary objective of the German summer offensive. It was a target of opportunity, a city whose capture would secure a flank and sever a supply line. The original plan did not envision a major urban battle. It envisioned rapid movement, encirclement, and the collapse of Soviet resistance in open terrain, where German operational superiority had consistently proven decisive. What it did not account for was that open terrain was about to end. The first German units reached the outskirts of Stalingrad in August of 1942. The city burned. German air bombardment had reduced much of it to rubble before the infantry even arrived, and this, paradoxically, was one of the first major German mistakes of the campaign, though no one recognized it as such at the time. Rubble is not neutral terrain. Rubble is a defender's dream. A city of intact buildings has clear lines of movement, predictable streets, identifiable structures that can be mapped and planned around. A city of ruins is something different entirely. A three-dimensional labyrinth of collapsed walls, underground passages, exposed rebar, and shattered concrete, where visibility rarely extends beyond 20 meters, and where the conventional advantages of combined arms warfare simply ceased to function. The doctrine that had made the Sixth Army great, speed, penetration, coordination between armor and infantry, the use of air power to paralyze enemy command, could not operate in a space measured not in kilometers, but in meters, sometimes in centimeters. The Soviet commander responsible for the defense of Stalingrad understood this with a clarity that bordered on genius. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the 62nd Army, articulated a principle that he would later describe simply as hugging the enemy. His forces were to maintain such close proximity to the German lines, sometimes separated by a single floor of a building, sometimes by a single wall, that German air support and artillery became too dangerous to use. To bomb the Soviet positions was to bomb themselves. Every building became a problem to be solved with bodies. Every staircase was contested. Every factory floor changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soldiers from both sides lost track of time, of direction, of the most basic coordinates of normal human existence. They lived in basements and rubble piles, cooked food over fires that might attract a sniper, slept in rooms where the next morning's objectives were visible through the hole in the wall. And here is something I genuinely want to know from you watching this right now, because I think about this question every time I return to this history. If you had been a commander watching your most powerful army slowly bleed out in a city it should have captured in days, at what point would you have made the decision to pull back, regardless of what your orders said? Because Paulus faced that question. His senior generals faced it, and the answer they gave, or rather, the answer that was given for them, is one of the most consequential decisions in the entire history of the Second World War. The weeks passed. September became October. October became November. The Sixth Army's divisions, which had entered the battle with their full complement of thousands of men each, shrank to fractions of themselves. Entire regiments were consolidated into formations that in any other context would have been called platoons. The names of the great industrial complexes within the city, the tractor factory, the Red October steel plant, the barricade ordnance factory, became synonymous not with industrial production, but with human cost, measured in the only currency Stalingrad accepted. And while the Sixth Army consumed itself in the ruins, something was being assembled in the frozen steppes to the north and south of the city. Something very large, very quiet, and very deliberate. The Soviet commander responsible for the defense of Stalingrad understood this with a clarity that bordered on genius. General Vasily Chukov, commanding the 62nd Army, articulated a principle that he would later describe simply as hugging the enemy. His forces were to maintain such close proximity to the German lines, sometimes separated by a single floor of a building, sometimes by a single wall, that German air support and artillery became too dangerous to use. To bomb the Soviet positions was to bomb themselves. Every building became a problem to be solved with bodies. Every staircase was contested. Every factory floor changed hands multiple times in a single day. Soldiers from both sides lost track of time, of direction, of the most basic coordinates of normal human existence. They lived in basements and rubble piles, cooked food over fires that might attract a sniper, slept in rooms where the next morning's objectives were visible through the hole in the wall. And here's something I genuinely want to know from you watching this right now, because I think about this question every time I return to this history. If you had been a commander watching your most powerful army slowly bleed out in a city it should have captured in days, at what point would you have made the decision to pull back, regardless of what your orders said? Because Paulus faced that question. His senior generals faced it, and the answer they gave, or rather, the answer that was given for them, is one of the most consequential decisions in the entire history of the Second World War. The weeks passed. September became October. October became November. The Sixth Army's divisions, which had entered the battle with their full complement of thousands of men each, shrank to fractions of themselves. Entire regiments were consolidated into formations that in any other context would have been called platoons. The names of the great industrial complexes within the city, the tractor factory, the Red October steel plant, the barricade ordnance factory, became synonymous not with industrial production, but with human cost, measured in the only currency Stalingrad accepted. And while the Sixth Army consumed itself in the ruins, something was being assembled in the frozen steppes to the north and south of the city. Something very large, very quiet, and very deliberate. The Soviet General Staff, Zhukov, Vasilevsky, the architects of what would become the most consequential counteroffensive of the war, had understood something fundamental. The Sixth Army was not the strategic problem. The flanks protecting the Sixth Army were the strategic problem. Stretching for hundreds of kilometers on either side of Stalingrad were the armies of Germany's allies, Romanian and Hungarian forces that were brave enough, but equipped with weapons and doctrine that were not prepared for what was about to hit them. The Soviets had mapped those flanks with meticulous attention. They knew where the weaknesses were. They had spent weeks moving armor, infantry, and artillery into position, concealing the movement with extraordinary discipline, maintaining radio silence, moving only at night. On the 19th of November, 1942, at 7:30 in the morning, 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously. The northern flank collapsed within hours. The southern flank, attacked the following morning, collapsed with similar speed. On the 23rd of November, the two arms of the Soviet pincer met at a bridge crossing on the Don River. The encirclement was complete. The Sixth Army, 330,000 men, was surrounded. The officers who understood maps and numbers knew immediately what that meant. The officers who understood logistics knew even faster. To supply 330,000 men by air required a daily delivery capacity that the German Air Force had never possessed and could not manufacture. To relieve the encirclement from outside required armored forces in quantities that did not exist in the southern sector of the front, and to break out from inside required permission that, when Paulus requested it, was denied. Hitler declared Stalingrad a fortress. The Sixth Army would hold. Resupply would come by air. A relief force would break through. None of these things happened. What happened instead was winter. There's a specific quality to suffering that becomes visible only at scale, when it is not one person or one family experiencing loss, but tens of thousands of human beings simultaneously, each one alone inside their own diminishing body, each one carrying the private arithmetic of their own survival, while around them the arithmetic of an entire army runs toward zero. The food rations inside the Stalingrad pocket were cut in November, cut again in December. By January, German soldiers in what had once been the most powerful army on the Eastern Front were surviving on less than 200 calories per day. The horses of the artillery units were slaughtered. When the horses were gone, soldiers ate whatever they could find: leather, boiled boot soles, scraps that would not have been considered food in any other context. The cold was not a backdrop to the suffering. It was a participant in it. At -30 and -40 degrees, wounds that might have been manageable in temperate conditions became death sentences. The field hospitals, basements and cellars with no heat, no clean instruments, no morphine, became places where men went to die more slowly than they would have in the open. The relief operation, commanded by Field Marshal Erich von Manstein, one of the most gifted operational minds Germany produced in the entire war, came agonizingly close. At its furthest point of advance, the relief column was less than 50 kilometers from the edge of the pocket. Soldiers inside the encirclement, on clear days when the artillery carried far, could hear the sound of guns that might mean rescue. Then the sound grew quieter. Then it stopped. There was no rescue. The final Soviet assault, Operation Ring, began in January 1943. It was systematic and methodical in a way that only a force that knows it is already won can afford to be. The pocket shrank. The frozen, starving remnants of the Sixth Army's divisions gave ground not in organized tactical withdrawals, but in the simple, exhausted way that men who have been pushed to the absolute limit of physical endurance give ground, because they have nothing left with which to hold it. On the 31st of January, 1943, Friedrich Paulus, promoted to Field Marshal by Hitler the previous day in what amounted to a clear instruction that German field marshals did not surrender, surrendered. 2 days later, the last pockets of resistance in the northern sectors of the city ceased to exist. The Sixth Army had ceased to exist. Approximately 90,000 German soldiers entered Soviet captivity in the days following the surrender. The camps they were sent to were brutal in ways that mirrored the brutality that German forces had visited upon Soviet prisoners in the years before. Disease, malnutrition, exhaustion, and cold continued the work that the battle itself had begun. Of the 330,000 men who had been encircled, fewer than 6,000 returned to Germany. The last of them came home in 1955, 12 years after the battle ended. The Sixth Army was reconstituted. Germany reorganized its divisions, reassigned its numbers, put new commanders in front of rebuilt formations that carried the same designation. But among those who had survived the original, the men who came back, the tiny fraction who crossed that impossible distance between Stalingrad and ordinary life, there was no confusion about what had happened. The Sixth Army, they had known, did not lose a battle and withdraw. It did not suffer a strategic setback and regroup. It was destroyed. And there's a meaningful difference between those two things that goes beyond military terminology. A force that loses a battle retains the possibility of learning from what it lost. Its experience survives. Its institutional knowledge survives. The lessons of its defeat can be studied and applied. A force that is destroyed leaves behind only absence. The knowledge dies with the men who carried it. The experience that could not be bought with anything except years of actual combat, years of fighting from Poland to France to Ukraine to the Volga, evaporated in the ruins of a city that had already been reduced to rubble before the dying began. Stalingrad proved something that the previous 3 years of German victory had almost succeeded in making the world forget. That power, real power, historically unprecedented military power, is not a permanent condition. It is a temporary state. sustained by choices, dependent on circumstances, and entirely capable of becoming its own worst enemy when the doctrine built for one kind of war is forced to fight a completely different one. The Sixth Army was not undone by cowardice. It was not undone by inferior soldiers or incompetent commanders at the unit level. It was undone by the gap between what it was built to do and what it was ordered to do, between a military philosophy designed for speed and open space and a city that offered neither. The families who waited at home, the ones who consulted lists and read official notifications and sat with the particular silence of those who do not yet know whether they are widows or wives. Many of them never received a clear answer. The men they were waiting for somewhere in the rubble of a Soviet city, or in a camp east of the Urals, or in a frozen field whose exact location no one had thought to record. 330,000 men. And in the end, what remains is not glory, not epitaphs, not the clean, legible narrative of sacrifice that wars are sometimes permitted to produce. What remains is the number itself, and the quiet, uncomfortable question underneath it, of what it means to build something extraordinary, and then send it somewhere it cannot survive. If this story stayed with you, if there's one moment in this history that you keep returning to, leave it in the comments. I read every one, and if you're watching this on a channel you only just found, welcome to Noctel.